Hey guys, Tyler Berger here with Bass Fishing HQ, and today I want to talk about probably the best soft plastic that has ever been made, which is the Gary Yamamoto Senko. Not only am I going to talk about the Senko, but really this applies to any soft plastic stick bait, whether you're fishing a Yum Dinger, a Googan Squad, Lunker Log, a Gambler Fat Ace. There's a lot of soft stick baits out on the market, and not only am I going to talk about those particular baits, but I also want to talk about 5 mistakes that a lot of guys make with that Senko style bait, so stay tuned, it's gonna be a good one. As always, this video is brought to you by the bass hat that I'm wearing right now. If you want to help support the Bass Fishing HQ channel, you can pick up a hat and help me to continue to bring you videos like this. All right guys, so the Senko, and you might call it a Senko, whatever it may be, whatever you call it, it's basically a soft plastic stick bait. This is a soft plastic that has been on the market for a long time now, and pretty much everyone who's ever picked up a bass fishing rod and reel knows that a Senko is just a fish catching machine. Mistake number 1 when it comes to fishing a Senko is actually using too thin of a hook when you wacky rig it. Now, if you guys don't know what a wacky rig is, it's simply a way of rigging a Senko kind of through the middle of the bait that gives it a really unique action as it falls. Because everyone thinks it's a finesse technique, they tend to use really finessey style hooks when it comes to fishing a wacky rig. Now, some guys will use a pretty small hook, and when I say small hook, I'm really talking about the diameter of the hook, the thickness of the hook. If you use a really small gauge wire hook when you're fishing a wacky rig, it's going to lead to a lot of issues, a lot of problems. The first one is that you're going to go through a tremendous amount of baits. Because that hook is so small, it basically just slices through your soft plastic. So when you go to skip that wacky rig up underneath an overhanging tree or over a dock, that soft plastic is just gonna go flying and you're gonna come back with a bare hook and you're gonna lose your Senko. It just creates a lot of frustration. So what a lot of guys have done is they've gone to using O-rings. Personally, I'm just not a big fan of the O-ring. Maybe you are, and that's fine if you are. Like I talk about when it comes to all fishing, if you are hooking up with fish and you're putting them in the boat or on the shore and you're not losing fish, then just stick to the way that you like to fish it. Because obviously it's working for you. Now me, I don't prefer the O-ring. And what makes a really big difference is simply using a thicker gauge hook. I'm not talking about using a huge tuna hook here or a giant flipping hook. I'm just talking about using a little bit thicker of a hook. This particular hook right here is a Gamakatsu G Finesse straight shank hook. It is extremely sharp. It's easy to penetrate in a fish's mouth, but it's also a little bit thicker gauge hook. It doesn't slice through that soft plastic. I have no problem hooking up with fish. You don't necessarily need to use this big of a hook. For instance, this is an octopus hook, and it is also a thicker hook. If you're using that octopus hook with a turned down eye, you're going to want to tie the hook to your line with a snell knot, because that's going to allow the fish to actually get hooked a lot better with that snell knot kind of on the back side of that hook. Let's talk about mistake number 2. And since we're kind of on the subject of fishing it weightless, one thing that a lot of guys do when they're fishing a weightless Senko is they're going to fish it in pretty shallow water. Now that makes sense because it has a little bit of a slower fall. But one thing that a lot of guys miss out on is actually fishing a weightless stick bait in deeper water. And I'm not talking about fishing it in 30 or 40 foot, although you could do that with a tremendous amount of patience. I'm simply just talking about fishing it in that 10 to 15 foot zone. You could put a weight on it and fish it as a Texas rig in this case, and you're gonna get bites, but everybody knows how that soft stick bait, the way that it falls, can really get a lot more bites than your traditional Texas rig. This is gonna require patience, but I'm telling you what, if you guys can't get fish to bite, maybe you're fishing an offshore school in that 10 to 15 foot zone, throw a weightless Senko at them, okay? This is something that they're not used to. Usually a lot of guys who are fishing offshore try to use heavier weights to try to trigger those bass, but instead you're using a very slow presentation. You're gonna be doing something that a lot of guys don't do, and therefore you're going to be getting a lot more bites. Mistake number 3 when it comes to fishing that Senko is really thinking that all these soft stick baits out there on the market are created equal, and this could not be me further from the truth. Although they look very similar, some of them have a lot of salt, a different plastic, some of them actually glide to the bottom, some of them actually shimmy to the bottom. They are not created equal. So just because you go to Walmart and you may see a very cheap pack of soft stick baits and you're looking at that in comparison to the Yamamoto Senko, they are not the same bait. Now, what I'm not saying is that the Senko always catches them better than that off-brand. For instance, I really love to use the Bass Pro Shops Sticko. The Bass Pro Shops Sticko is probably the closest worm out there on the market that has pretty much the same action as that Gary Yamamoto Senko, but it's literally half or even a third of the price. So really, I'm saving money while still getting the same action. Now, if you look at the soft stick bait made by Yum, this is called the Dinger. And the Dinger is a very different bait. If you throw it on a very light hook, it'll actually just stay on the top of the surface for a while. Like, it has an incredibly slow fall to it. The plastic almost floats. So I don't really tend to fish a Yum Dinger weightless because it just doesn't have that kind of back and forth shimmy action that I really like in the Sticko or the Senko. But there is a time and a place when I really like to use that Yum Dinger bait. For instance, if I'm fishing a Texas rig with that Senko style bait, I really like to use the Yum Dinger because of its buoyancy. It really kind of helps it to stand off the bottom, which I think gets me extra bites in comparison to that Senko or the Sticko that are gonna kind of pivot down and fall on the bottom. So with talking about the different type of plastics and the different type of Stickos, this actually brings up mistake number 4. And mistake number 4 is only fishing a Senko weightless and on a Texas rig. One of the very best ways to fish that Senko style bait is actually on a shaky head. Now, this isn't my idea at all. I didn't come up with this. I actually first heard about this from Keith Pochet. And this is something that if you ever watch Keith Pochet fishing, whether that's on Major League Fishing or even some of his older tournaments on bass, the guy really likes a soft stick bait style bait. I remember watching a video or a tournament, I can't remember what it was, but he talked about fishing that Senko style, that thicker soft plastic on a shaky head. A lot of us, when we pick up a shaky head, we're typically picking up a little bit thinner of a worm. Maybe it's some sort of finesse style worm. Now, the Senko is a bigger, thicker worm, and Keith Pochet talks about how he gets just as many, if not more bites on that Senko style shaky head than on that small finesse style shaky head. And one of the best things about that is he actually fishes it on a bait cast rod and reel setup. So instead of using that spinning rod, which a spinning rod definitely has a time and a place, but if you can get away with using a bait cast rod and maybe 12-pound line instead of 6 or 8-pound line, personally, I'm gonna prefer to do that. So when you think about a Senko, don't think about just fishing it weightless on a Texas rig, pick up that shaky head. Another great way to actually fish that Senko bait is actually on the back of a Carolina rig. So shaky heads, Carolina rigs, don't rule out the Senko style bait for any soft plastic application. The 5th mistake that a lot of guys make with the Senko is not fishing it in kind of this under the radar technique that I'm about to tell you about. Now, at the start of this video, we talked about fishing the Senko on a Wacky rig. And typically when you fish a Senko on a Wacky rig, you're gonna cast it out and you're just gonna let it fall naturally to the bottom. About 90% of the time, that's when you get your bites. Now, one way you can actually fish a Wacky rig is just below the surface, and you're gonna be constantly pumping that rod. I actually picked this up by watching David Dudley's videos. I don't think he's actually ever really talked about it, but if you watch the way that he fishes that Senko, a lot of times he's gonna cast that bait up on a Wacky rig and he's gonna work it just below the surface of the water. This is the exact same way that I fish a floating worm. Basically, you're gonna pump that bait right below the surface, let it fall for literally maybe 6 inches, and then just continue to work it. And this is a very exciting way because you're gonna see every one of the fish that hit your bait. They're gonna come up there, they're gonna snatch it from on top. It's kind of like a finesse topwater presentation to trigger bass. There's times when they're gonna hit a Senko worked just below the surface when they're not gonna hit any other bait, literally any other bait. If you guys start fishing it this way in lakes, ponds, rivers, wherever you fish. Not only is it one of the best ways to catch fish, but you're going to be surprised at just how effective it is. If you guys want to know more about soft plastics and specifically about Texas rigs, you can click on this video right here where I talk about 5 mistakes that a lot of anglers make with the Texas rigs. If you enjoyed this video, give it a like, comment below, and subscribe. I'll see you guys in the next video.